All right. Well, welcome back to the circuit. And today I am pleased to have three guests with me as we try our first panel discussion around the area of Hardtech. So I have with me today President and CEO of TechPoint and my colleague, Ting Gootee, along with Nida Ansari, and she is principal at HG Ventures, and then Ryan Henderson, who is the Director of Innovation and Digital Transformation at Conexus, a sister initiative to TechPoint. And we're going to talk about Hardtech because it just so happens that the three of you are all founding members of Hardtech Indiana. And we want to try to wrap our hands around what is Hardtech and talk about some of the implications for what that means for the state of Indiana. So each organization here supports Hardtech companies. I'd like to level set on how each of us defines Hardtech, some examples of Hardtech companies and how it differs from other tech. So who wants to take the first shot at that in terms of what Hardtech is? Nida, I'm going to lean in on. I'm going to lean in on.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So HG Ventures is an investor in the state of Indiana, and we invest globally. And one of the sectors that we invest in is called Hardtech. The way we define it, and it has a broad definition, right? So the broader definition being any product or process that can be made tangibly touched, but facilitated and enabled by tech, SaaS, or a technology, right? For us specifically, there are some realms of Hardtech that are out of play, like ag tech, medical devices, healthcare devices, consumer devices. Those are out of play for us, but that's the only reason being we invest in spaces at the Heritage Group. From a corporate perspective, we invest in industries or verticals where we can help. So that's kind of, we invest in a subset of Hardtech, but we call ourselves Hardtech investors.
Anyone want to add anything to that in terms of what Hardtech is?
Yeah, we can jump in. I think from the Conexus perspective, we have really been looking at it as a combination of manufactured hardware enabled by software, or where that manufactured hardware meets software. And especially as Nida had said, like the physical product, so product innovation through those two components. And we look very broadly at the type of startups that we'd call kind of hard tech. So Industry 4.0, biotech, sustainable materials, next-gen materials, water and waste management, aerospace and defense applications, and then also software as a service for the advanced industry vertical. So since manufacturing cuts across a lot of different subsectors, we're definitely keeping it very broad.
Ting,
yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, those are perfect points. Tech in particular, kind of given the nature of who TechPoint has been and what we're trying to become, not just on a standalone basis, but in relation to all the other vertical intersectionality piece, really kind of forced my team and me to really thinking hard and broad about what tech means and how what's TechPoint's mission will continue to evolve in a broader context. And we have kind of repositioned recently TechPoint to be not just generic tech, because it could come all various different flavors. Even some people think hydrogen as being tech, which in a way, but necessarily in our wheelhouse. The specific thing we play in the tech that's really horizontal enablement across the board is more digital innovation piece or digital piece. So I think that translates really well in terms of thinking about how digital intersect with the hardware component for the manufacturing industry that gets into the digital 4.0 on the ag tech. There's some specific intersectionality there on the ag tech side. And that's similar to anything related to material science, because all the processing, everybody's workload flow and processing manufacturing involve a digital component. It may not be the most prominent output, but definitely from a digital technology demand perspective, that's how TechPoint and a lot of technology come into play. I will say the only thing that we don't, maybe in the hard tech sector, that we don't necessarily touch is nothing digital. That does not involve a digital piece. Roger and I had that conversation when we're doing outventure support. If it's just a company's purely manufacturing animal feed, for instance, that doesn't involve a technology drive new products or services, then it's probably was more on the peripheral industry, which could present opportunities for technology to come in and play a pretty pivotal role in terms of business transformation.
So while manufacturing and hardware is arguably the oldest and most mature area for innovation and technology, there's a lot of renewed interest and buzz around hard tech startups and investments. Can you share from your perspectives why you think that is? And let's start with Nida on this question too, since you specifically are representing a company that invests in hard tech.
Sure.
But also leveraging asset base, the big corporate the base they already have in their company.
That's great. Yeah. So I might take a broader historical cut at that, right? Because so my background is in manufacturing. I was in product management, supply chain globally for a number of companies prior to joining HT Ventures. And the interesting phenomenon that happened was, there was a lot of offshoring. If you think about the early 2000s, let's say, I'm not going to go too far back now that we think about it, that's 23 years ago, but it's pretty far back. There's a lot of manufacturing that went to China, that went to East Asia, that went to other regions of the world because we couldn't keep up from a cost perspective. They left because of a cost advantage in those regions. I remember when I was working in manufacturing now about a decade ago, a lot of that cost started to become at parity with so that it was labor intensive, right? The manufacturing was labor intensive. But now when you've got this tech component of automation, of end-to-end diagnostics, visibility of processes, inventory management, supply chain becoming more fluid, the US becomes more competitive. Again, relative to those regions that had taken the, where the offshoring had led to. So you've got this macro phenomenon of onshoring that's happening. And when you think about now, when you go back to somewhat of a micro level, Indiana has been the number one manufacturing state in the nation. And in order to stay competitive, there's a huge tech component that needs to layer on to what the goods and services that we're making in order to make sure that anything that comes back this way, all that onshoring that comes back this way, is done so in a cost competitive way. So that's more broader than what the Heritage Group does and participates in. But when you think about what the Heritage Group participates in, it's in infrastructure, construction materials, environmental services. All of those things are truly important from a sustainability, circularity, one supply chain, traceability, and transparency. So when you think about what I've layered here is you've got macro trends, you've got economic trends, you've got the opportunity for Indiana to really take to remain and keep its foothold in being the number one manufacturing state of the nation. And so that's why Hardtech Indiana, as our committee calls itself, we've got a unique opportunity to allow and enable entrepreneurs to kind of thrive in this space geographically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I'll add on to that. A lot of such transformation has already taken place inside our corporate partners in our state. We just have now surfaced and provide a lot more visibility into those activities. Now, it's very fortunate that I prior to this role, like Nida and Ryan, we spent a lot of time with the startups, and sometimes the hardest thing you're trying to help with the startups is finding the true voice of customer, given the strong enterprise customer-facing aspects of all the startup aspect of the startup business ideas and business that we're trying to help get off the ground, not fully realizing what's already happening within the innovation cycle that's happening within their customer base. A lot of times are this mid-cos and big-cos, both in terms of opportunities and challenges. And a great example being Cummins, who's been very much involved. I mean, we think about Cummins, one of those Fortune 500 companies, hundreds of years history, based out of Indiana. If we ask people here today, what does Cummins do? You generally, the branding associate image was engines company, right? But if you go to the Cummins website, they actually, curiously, they have quietly branded themselves to be a global power technology company. That's saying something. And it's also, more importantly, they're not so quietly on a global stage using a lot of technology gradually intentionally transforming the products and services that they're offering to their customer base. So even beyond just the whole cost parity, stay competitive, they want to be you as innovation leader and presenting the future leading products and services that would not be associated with the traditional Cummins engine manufacturing company. So that's very telling, and those are the opportunities, the assets that's happening out here in our community. But we as a community groups have more opportunity to surface those as well.
What, maybe throwing in an extra question here, but what's been the reluctance in Indiana venture capital firms or just investors to invest in Hardtech? Because I mean, I talked to hundreds and hundreds of investors, and I can remember just in years past, as soon as I say it's Hardtech, they're like, "Oh, we don't invest in Hardtech." They also don't invest in medical devices that require FDA. I mean, there's this kind of list, right? So why is that such a limitation, or why does it seem to be a limitation for potential investors?
So I can take that. I think one of the Hardtech is hard. It involves hard sciences. It involves a lot of capital investment. So if you take a SaaS company and give them $100,000, that is far more meaningful than $100,000 given to a company that might need to scale or build a physical location, invest in people, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So the dollar for dollar doesn't go as far at the early stages. But when you look at the financial return and the jobs created, Hardtech companies are very well equipped to be able to have a tremendous impact on an economic scale for whatever geographical location they're in. So I'd say there is a reticence because among investors because you've got faster returns. You've got lower capex, and speaking of just tech software, but I'm sure Ting, you've had quite a bit of experience in investing. I'm sure you have a perspective on it, since I believe you were mostly on the SaaS side, but you could probably speak to it too.
Yeah, it's definitely the perceived capital intensity. It's a barrier because we, as an emerging venture community, the sort of local pool of capital, not just writing the first $500,000 checks, but continue to write checks to get to the right inflection point, is that the required capital depth. I mean, we as a community are still building that professionalized, managed pool of capital depth, but it's just going to take time because fundraising, even for VCs to raise a fund, it's hard. It's hard business. And unfortunately, along the way, we have the corporate venture folks like Heritage Group, Allegiant, and Lilly's of the world that are doing their own corporate investing piece that can help alleviate some of the lack of depth in capital piece for the Hardtech opportunities. And the second thing, I think, is just general, right or wrong. It just this perceived long cycle to market. To Nida's point, it's not a hardware you can just put on app store and then within 3 weeks whether you get to the million users or not, right? It's a long sales cycle, go to market cycle, which I think speaks to the opportunity, the importance, what some of the stuff the Heritage Group and others, and even the Cummins, the corporate partnership, what they're doing from a capital, speeding up the speed to pathway to market piece. Those are the opportunities, because that's why some of the accelerated stuff that Nida was doing still is involved in with Heritage Group is important, because investors want that level of confidence that not only there's a market validation of the problem, but there's folks on the other hand, on the other side ready to pick up the market, to integrate a lot of these product services into whatever they're offering as soon as a prototype get to the commercial stage. And those two tend to be longer from that perspective. So really kind of mitigate the financing risk and go-to-market risk from a customer perspective will go a long way to kind of counterbalance some of those right perceptions, but still problem solve.
Yeah.
I think to kind of just to make a fine point on what you said, Ting, about going to market. From like the Conexus Indiana perspective, we're constantly supporting Hardtech entrepreneurs that want to sell and deploy their technologies into advanced manufacturing and logistics facilities, or maybe they're seeking a partnership for contract manufacturing or research and development. But it's not easy to get those solutions into a manufacturing facility. Several reasons. I mean, there are a lot of competing technologies. So if I think of cobots, collaborative robotics, which has had a lot more success than some of the other technologies for manufacturing and logistics, the amount of effort it is to go to market on a new cobot product is huge, and it's a long process to be successful there. And looking from sort of the customer perspective, the companies are always looking for outside sources of innovation. So if you're a manufacturing or logistics company, you kind of have that on your mind, but you have all these metrics, business case and workforce training and use case selection that you have to figure out before you partner with a Hardtech company.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Even just from a product and service implementation standpoint, it's a complex environment. Whether you're fitting into the manufacturing process or otherwise, it's operating a lot of these plants and it requires the different components. And we're even seeing that in the software space. Even if you're just selling a pure enterprise level software, the question always comes up: how does that speak to other software systems already in place? Mm-hmm. So the more technology a customer adopts, the more integration and complexity kind of introduces. So having that companies and innovators really thinking through how does that fit into the workflow, again, from a go-to-market and voice of customer standpoint, it's really important. It's something many of them don't necessarily have the domain knowledge. I think that's oftentimes a lot of these entrepreneur service organizations or corporate partners can really lean in and help with.
Let's focus in on Indiana a little bit now, since that's where we all are. What makes Indiana well positioned to support Hardtech innovation, and what are some examples of how our community supports Hardtech entrepreneurs?
I'm happy to tackle this one, at least from the manufacturing perspective. And Nida, you mentioned it earlier. I think the manufacturing infrastructure that Indiana has, so most manufacturing intense state by percentage of GDP, most jobs per capita. There's a lot of subject matter experts we have here to help Hardtech companies scale, get subject matter expertise to think through that go-to-market strategy or the product development life cycle. We have a significant intensity of startup accelerator programs that are focused on Hardtech broadly. So the Heritage Group, of course, I'll let Nida touch on that. And then a lot of generator programs that are broadly focused on Hardtech, and then a newer program, an IoT product accelerator from the Indiana IoT Lab and Matchbox out of Lafayette. So there are a lot of good things that are happening here that I think build that support structure that early stage companies may need.
Yep. And I think that someone mentioned, Nida, I think you talked about, reshoring or onshoring, right? I mean, there's definitely an interest in the state of Indiana from the top down to incentivize Hardtech growth, in particular around a few areas. So I see a lot of heads nodding. I'd love to get some of your thoughts on what Indiana in particular is doing. What kinds of Hardtech is the state interested in terms of growing here?
I could take that. I'm not sure that I can speak to it from a state perspective, but I do know that from an ecosystem perspective, we've got the right recipe here in the state, right? So, like Ryan was talking about, we've got accelerators, we've got the beginnings of capital investment, we've got entrepreneurs eager to start or move businesses here. What From a trend perspective, because we're in manufacturing, because we've got a lot of manufacturing in this state in a variety of end markets, right? You've got the Cummins, you've got the Eli Lillys, but you've got plastic, you've got healthcare, you've got a variety of end markets. What ends up being really interesting for us to think about is clean tech, right? So clean tech being circularity, right? So are those spaces that could be interesting for us to specialize in Indiana? I'm sure Ryan and Ting have a point of view on what their verticals might be for us here. The Heritage Group being uniquely located here, we do focus on environmental services. We take on the waste of all the Fortune 200 manufacturing companies all over the United States. And our focus is circularity. So when we take in that waste, there's a really, really strong look at making sure that as little of it as possible ends up in a landfill or an incinerator. So when you think about what that means, when you back it up into the manufacturing processes, there's an opportunity to make those processes leaner, greener, and a lot more efficient to a point where does that make sense for Indiana to move forward with? And I think there's a startup genome study that we did in 2021 through the IEDC that found that the clean tech might be a really interesting space for Indiana to take a look at from a state perspective. And again, these words are buzzwords, but they're quite broad, but they're very meaningful to what we do and what we produce here in Indiana. And when you think about the layered systems of services and ecosystem, from grants that Conexus and Ryan help with, to the venture support program that you and Ting and TechPoint has put together, we've got a really interesting inflection point here in Indiana that could springboard us into being the space that people look at. We shouldn't be, and we have been, I think, the flyover state, right? And a little bit of a black hole when it comes to a startup that's on the coast isn't going, oh my gosh, my end, my destination is Indiana. It's us looking from the in to the out, to say this is what we could be known for, and that's we've got the recipe there, but it's the putting together of that story and actually talking about it in a forum like this to say it makes sense. Let's do it here, right? So
yeah, and I would double click. I really like the analogy that Nida was using, the recipe and then different ingredients, right? And that sometimes for us, particularly who's in this community happening for a long time, tend to overlook the fact that a lot of these ingredients didn't really exist 10 or 20 years ago. Even as 5 to 8 years ago, you think about financial crisis now, that was literally the disruption in the marketplace that capital all of a sudden dried up for everybody. And fast forward today, barely 15 years later, we had a lot more venture funds providing most of us still see it in early stage, but that's just part of the growth, right? You can't, it's hard to start with a later stage fund. You got to earn your track record. But the number of family offices and capital sources and professionally managed fund compared to 10 years ago in this market has gone up, quite a bit. Same with resource groups, whether it's through mentorships and accelerators and programs. Space, it's another big one. Co-working space, a whole boom around co-working space. None of those existed until quite a few years after the financial crisis. So to both Nida's and Ryan's point, those are the ingredients already in place. Now we just what can we do with them as an overall community? And I think there's a recognition, at least from those of us in the community building roles, we don't necessarily need to launch something again brand new on our own, but let's try to make the ingredients work with the ingredients that we have, really make a bigger impact out of all this, providing visibility to the right resource partners. To me, it's almost not necessarily the current phase problem we're facing, not necessarily lack thereof, but how do we how do we provide more access to the right resources? And I think that similar kind of resource orchestration, building more connected networks concept is kind of resonating with the state leadership as well. You can see that through Roger, to your point earlier, a lot of this big federal grant opportunities requires a lot of intentional collaboration among different partners, and the state is taking a very strong leadership role in orchestrating all that. That's great to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great segue, I think, into the next question, which is, or the next, I guess is a question, the announcement of Hardtech Indiana as a collaborative panel between our organizations. So how do you see Hardtech Indiana supporting the next generation of hardtech innovators? And Ryan, I'll throw this at you first.
Yes. So Hardtech Indiana, I think the premise of bringing together the ecosystem support organizations was, how can we have one unified voice to support hard tech companies to tell the story of hard tech innovation in Indiana? So we pulled together the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, Agrinovis, the Heritage Group Ventures, 16 Tech, Innovation District, IU Ventures, Elevate Ventures, and TechPoint to work on that mission. And we spent a lot of 2022 piloting some concepts and convening hard tech entrepreneurs in Indiana to kind of learn who they are, what they're working on, and how we can support. And then in 2023, we had a big kickoff event at the 16 Tech Innovation District and had over 120 folks attending there, and held some panels, one on venture capital and grant funding, and another on innovation spaces. And I'm blanking on the other topic that we and accelerator programs. And we also wanted to learn from those events. And I think, from that event, we kind of know what companies need from us, and we can adjust moving forward as a committee and keep kind of strategically supporting companies where it makes sense.
Yeah, and when you think about the players that Ryan named, right? I led with, we play in a HG. Ventures plays in a subset of Hardtech. When you think about the players that Ryan named for this committee, we're all bringing a different piece of the pie to this thing, right? And to this organization, committee, whatever you want to call it. And our intent isn't to reinvent the wheel. Our intent isn't to replace anything that each of these organizations is doing, but really to come together. And I think Ryan's heard me use this analogy before, is that, we and Ting recognized that we're all kind of making our little efforts in Hardtech, but we're all little tugboats trying to pull this giant cruise liner along, but we're slightly, off, right? We're going towards our own destinations. When we talk as Hardtech Indiana, we have a common goal, and that provides us the general efficiency to say, what are you guys seeing in the marketplace? Because I just saw this. This is how I saw at a conference Hardtech being defined. Do we want to think about that this way here? Or how do we want to be represented? Our intent isn't to be an events-based organization, but really thinking about it from an entrepreneur perspective. If entrepreneurship is hard, so here are a couple hypotheses, right? Entrepreneurship is hard. Hardtech is hard. And Indiana is the place to be for Hardtech. If all those three things are true, I feel like the thing that we need to solve for is, how do we make Hardtech entrepreneurship in Indiana as easy as possible, right? And each of us has a role to play in that. But when we think about it from the entrepreneur's perspective, how do we incept entrepreneurs here? And how do we draw entrepreneurs to the state of Indiana? And each of us has a role to play in being able to do that. And uniquely, right? We complement each other in the best of ways. So,
I will echo that. What I love about Hardtech Indiana, one, it's a grassroots. Two, it's self-driven. Three, there is collective ownership in face of the common problem. Ownership, not only recognizing how big the problem is, and also recognizing that not anybody alone can solve it. We really have to play each different piece. So we all have our own ownership, share ownership, but nobody really owns this Hardtech thing because it's really a community-driven thing from the ground up. And everybody came to the table with a unique assets. I call it, it's no different than a startup, the sweat equity piece. But once we get this funding, get some market traction, we'll see how, just like any other organization startup, let's see how can we scale it up, whether continued sweat equity or otherwise. But it's great to have that strong foundation, that shared drive to really build upon.
And there's not a lot of places, honestly, outside of, I've lived in, this is my 7th city, right? Like there's not a lot of places in the United States where you can say that we're running an organization with a committee with 8 organizations, each with their distinct visions, or we're running it as a community and everybody's just doing what they need to do and we come together and we do it well, right? Indiana happens to be one of the most connected physical states. Indianapolis happens to be one of the most connected states, and it's showing in the work that we're doing. I don't think there's on any other place or any other committee that I've been on in any other place in the United States where I could say I just show up and I'm just giving my time to this community. We all collectively take responsibility for it. There's no one leading. I mean, there's no one pulling and pushing for agenda. It's just community driven, and you can't say that about. I don't know. And I would challenge anybody to say that. You could say it about any other place that isn't Indiana, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what we're doing by working together is we're trying to make it easier, but we're creating a platform, we're creating a place where those entrepreneurs can feel comfortable to know that they have the backing of different organizations, to know that there are potential investors here, that there are accelerators here that can help them. And it really is the coming together of all our organizations and probably more. So for people who are maybe watching this podcast and you're thinking, wow, we need to be a part of that, then by all means, please let us know because we want you to work with us.
Absolutely.
So last question, as we look towards the next year, what are the areas investors and entrepreneurs should be watching for in hard tech innovation here in Indiana?
I'll take it from the manufacturing perspective. I think we've seen a lot of semiconductor manufacturing come back into the U.S., and there's been some big developments in the state of Indiana. And there's just a lot of space in that big manufacturing subsector where it's ripe for hard tech innovation, right? There's fabrication, there's packaging, there's all these processes that are really intricate, really complicated, that companies, that startup companies could, provide some value to. I think there's also biopharmaceutical manufacturing as well, which Indiana has historically been a leader. But you think of vaccine development and other new drugs, just a lot of space as well for some of the medical leaning hard tech startups to get their footing in. And then the last one that comes to mind is kind of the electrification of everything. And I'm thinking a lot about Indiana's leadership in automotive and aerospace. So just thinking about that transition and all the potential innovation that will happen there in terms of the outside source of innovation to these OEM automotive suppliers and so on. So a lot of different places that it could unfold.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think layering onto the vertical, we could see it in supply chain and the technology that enables all of those things, right? In hard tech, if you've got transparency, you've got dashboards, you've got information that needs to be easily processed and viewed from the start of it in a manufacturing process all the way to the end of the manufacturing process. You're going to see, however that in whatever vertical that unfolds, you're going to see the transparency and the increase in the amount of information needed to enable each of those verticals, right? Any one of those verticals. So I think my perspective would also be that it could be in clean tech, it could be in environmental services. with the level of infrastructure that we have building. It could be in renewables. So we've named all the buzzwords, right, between Ryan and I, but I think that speaks to the level of opportunity that we have in Indiana because of the major players that we have here. So it truly is an inflection point. It's the possibilities are endless.
Right. There's a lot of, it's not just one industry that dominates Indiana, right? There's just a huge mix from automotive and food and beverage and plastic products all the way to some of the kind of software companies that are headquartered in Indianapolis. The market has it's just very diverse in terms of its industries. So a lot of opportunity.
And I would just conclude by saying, from a technology standpoint, given the heavy business to business software or tech focus, digital focus that we have here in our state, for a lot of these technology buyers and users, particularly in the corporate setting, platform consolidation has been going on for years. So it's no longer sufficient just to be that point solution, even though it can be the super cool point solution. And how do you fit into the whole complex workflow and environment? It's important from day one to think about. And then later on top of that, obviously, AI is in everybody's mind. Chatbots, intelligence, conversational, however you visual, audio, or you want to not having that piece, it's going to be more and more problematic. Some of us were just on the call earlier today. Literally, it's a government-sponsored community site. Even the AI and chatbots, intelligent chatbots, start to come up as a potential competition for information. So just the rapid market, even the mass commercial adoption we all been hoping for decades is finally here. The speed, it just can be a little frightening sometimes for these companies who are trying to put a foothold in the very noisy and crowded marketplace.
Yeah.
I think if we flip to the other side of it, like if I was an entrepreneur and I heard this answer, I would basically say, all right, well, I could be an entrepreneur in any hard tech space, and Indiana might be the place for me. And is it true? I really do think that it very well could be. Like you're when you think about the committee that we have, right? We've got players in the healthcare space, we've got players in the infrastructure space, we've got players in the environmental services space, clean tech, circularity, advanced materials, next generation materials, all of which have a place here in Indiana. So if I was an entrepreneur, I'd say, okay, well, how do I and where do I get started? And the people and the faces that you see here, hearing, talking about this is a great place to start. But that's the evolution that we're going to keep working on as Hardtech Indiana, is to make sure that it's easier and easier for an entrepreneur that might either have an idea or might have a scaled business that's somewhere else and is looking for we're looking for growth or a place to scale, a physical place to scale, to easily just say, all right, well, Ting is the person I need to call if I want to end up in the right place, right? But it really is that there's a lot of verticals that Indiana happens to be in pockets. If you look at not just central Indiana, if you look at Indiana as a state, there's pockets where we're good at. We've got medical, we've got plastics, we've got manufacturing, we've got tech. And again, it goes back to that recipe. So,
yeah, and we're seeing that we have been through our venture reports, quarterly venture reports, different vertical tech opportunities, where the venture dollars and what's the deal flow and deal value. And to Nida, this excellent point, it's no longer just a few that we're familiar with. The data actually shows that we're seeing more startup venture investing activity in a dozen different verticals here. And it's Roger and I were the ones who was cleaning up trying to ascribe verticals to the deals. It's getting harder and harder. And yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for your time today. Again, Ryan Henderson, Ting, Gootee, Nida Ansari. Thanks for giving us about an hour of your time today to be devoted to this topic, which we think is very important. And again, it is the collaboration, I think, that's going to allow us to be successful. I think that's what we've proven in the past with soft tech, and we've certainly built a foundation here. Indiana has become a very tech-friendly tech hub, in my opinion. And I think that we have the pieces in place to take the next step, which is to grow out hard tech in the state of Indiana as well. So again, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for hosting, Roger.